Chapter 19. Caspian was filled with fury upon returning to the castle late last night. Although he thought his unexpected encounter in the forest with Red Riding Hood couldn't have come at a better time. He had accompanied Red back to her cottage, and they talked about his beloved Cinderella. The king didn't want to ask too many questions. He wasn't ready to reveal his true identity to her. The more Red talked of Cindy's life, the more he was convinced that she was the right one for him. He was angry that her stepmother dared to use him, steal his beloved painting, and blame Cinderella. He understood everything now, and wished he could have acted sooner. The funny thing was that Caspian remembered Cindy's father. Years ago, when his Catherine was still alive, he'd sold him an exquisite, well-made rug. Red also brought him to Cindy's house, the estate that used to belong to Cindy's father. The king had another problem. Red was convinced that Cindy was getting married tomorrow, and that only gave him a small window of opportunity to act. He wasn't certain if he'd be able to find her in time to stop the wedding. The castle was immersed in silence as he was pacing in his chamber. Then he spoke to a few advisors, asked them to spread a few rumors around the kingdom that he was, in fact, going through with his search for a new wife. Caspian needed to track her down. He clenched his fists, knowing that she had only been trying to protect him. He didn't care about her past. He'd already known about it the night he'd met her. As a last resort, he was prepared to send his troops out in order to find her and bring her back to the castle. That night he didn't sleep, and as a vampire he didn't need to anyway. Sometimes he enjoyed pretending he was still a human, especially when Eric was growing up. At some point he must have drifted off, but his mind was still working overtime. He awoke again around 6 in the morning and began walking around the chamber, ready to jump back on his horse and travel to Gardland's kingdom in order to find her. His son was getting married in a couple of weeks, and after the king's announcement, Eric believed Caspian was moving too fast. The king had been alone for over 20 years, and Eric thought his father was planning to steal his glory. At 7 o'clock, his personal butler brought his breakfast in as usual. The king didn't have to eat, but people needed to believe that he was just like them. "Is there anything else that you need, my lord?" Rudolph asked, staring at him as though he knew the king was concerned about something. Caspian dragged his hand through his hair, thinking about his answer, when someone barged inside his chamber. It was Jeremy, one of the assistants who worked in the kitchen. He couldn't have been more than 16 years old. His chest was rising and falling in rapid movements, and it looked as if he had been running all the way to the king's chamber. My lord, sorry for the intrusion, but Dominic sent me to speak to you. It's early, and I was afraid—"
"It's all right. Just start from the beginning. What's going on?"
Caspian asked, waving to the butler to leave them alone. The boy placed his hands on his thighs, taking long, deep breaths. People in the castle always respected him. They knew that he was fair, and he looked after them well. Jeremy nodded, and the king handed him a glass of water. The boy looked like he could do with a drink. After a few minutes, he finally started making sense. "There's a man in the courtyard with a lady. They're both demanding to speak to you, my lord. General Davies doesn't want to let them in and keeps telling them that they should come back at a more appropriate time, but they are refusing to leave," Jeremy explained, and the king frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone and wasn't in the mood to resolve any sort of conflict between two peasants.
"Davies is competent enough to deal with them,"
Caspian snapped. He was wasting time this morning, and Cindy was somewhere out there, probably getting ready for her wedding day. "He has tried to reason with her, but that woman insists that you know something about this girl who's gone missing. She isn't prepared to speak to anyone but you, my lord," Jeremy explained.
"The girl's gone missing?"
Caspian repeated. "Yes, the woman insists that you know something about her." Caspian shifted in his chair, then got up and headed to the door, forgetting about his breakfast.
"All right, let me speak to them,"
he muttered more to himself. He was heading toward the direction of the stables anyway, and needed to see what this peasant woman wanted from him. He didn't think that this issue had anything to do with Cindy, but there was always a possibility. Her stepmother had learned that he'd spent a night with her, and he'd sent his advisors around the kingdom several days ago to find her, using the only other item of clothing he had left, her sparkling shoe. He kept the lace knickers to himself. Jeremy followed behind him. 10 minutes later, Caspian walked through the main hall, and new hope flickered through him. In the distance, he could see Cindy's stepmother and her future husband. They were arguing with Davies, who looked like he was just about to lose his temper. A few other guards gathered around them, too. He needed to play his cards right. Cindy's stepmother had no idea that he knew of her actions.
What is the meaning of this?
Caspian asked, approaching the group. He remembered Cindy's stepmother from the ball, and he'd instantly taken a disliking to her.
My lord, please allow us a few minutes with you. My stepdaughter, Cindy, has gone missing, the woman said, rushing to him. She was upset because her carefully prepared plan was suddenly falling apart. He was trying extremely hard to restrain himself from exploding. Yes, it's our wedding day today, and she vanished last night. We're in Garland's kingdom. I don't understand why, but Ida believes that the stupid girl might have come back to Farrington, the man named Londas said, shaking his head. Caspian sensed that Ida had magic. Not much. Someone must have helped her with the most basic spells, and that was dangerous enough. She must have given the old witch something for this new power. Caspian knew exactly how this all worked, so he needed to remain vigilant. Cindy was strong, and stuck between going to prison or marrying someone she didn't love, she simply ran away. Caspian was hoping she was in Farrington. Either way, he needed to find her. It's all right, Davies. Let's move to the conference chamber where we won't be disturbed,
the king said, and then showed Ida and Londas the best place where they could talk. Caspian's expression remained neutral, but in his mind he was already imagining having her in his arms again. He attempted to hide his anger. Ida would end up in prison eventually, but he had to have evidence proving everything she'd done. Once they moved to the conference room, Ida started telling him how the entire wedding had been arranged, the venue, the musicians, and church. Garland's kingdom was a few hours' horse ride away. She must have been kidnapped or taken against her will. We were doing the last fittings for her dress, and then I sent her away to tell my other daughters to meet us at the bakery, and she vanished, Ida said, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. We thought that maybe you, my lord, might have heard something. You were so fond of her at the ball.
Yes, I must ask for your assistance, my lord. As a proud resident of Garland's kingdom, the wedding plans have been put on hold, and I have so many relatives who are travelling from all parts of the country to celebrate with us. Cindy must be found soon, Londas said, and Caspian was angry, furious that this man was treating his precious Cindy like nothing more than livestock. He was barely controlling himself around them. I'm afraid that Cindy hasn't come to see me, if that's what you're asking, but I will send out a search party right away, he assured them. But I have to ask, maybe Cindy was unhappy. Perhaps she simply ran away to avoid being married. Of course, it's not my intention to disrespect anyone here.
Ida paled and glanced at Londas, who still had a stupid expression on his face. Caspian was playing a game with them, and he was glad Ida and that fool had come to see him. Now he could track Cindy down on his own terms. This whole thing had gone entirely too far.
No, of course not, my lord. It was love at first sight between her and Mr. Londas. They were so happy together, and now we're all concerned about her safety, Ida replied quickly. She was an evil woman, and he didn't even want to look at her. Yes, she was looking forward to a new life on the farm, Londas said, stroking his fat jaw. Her living situation in Farrington was a bit more comfortable. But that doesn't change the fact that we were perfectly matched."
Caspian didn't want to hear any more. Ida must have made some sort of deal with Londus. Maybe she promised him money. She married Cindy's father for a reason, just so she could take over his estate. Everything was finally making sense to him.
"Please, leave this to me. We will find her,"
he said simply, indicating that was the end of the conversation. He walked to the door, and Ida continued to thank him, still crying and saying that she was really concerned about her stepdaughter's safety. As soon as they were gone, he called Jeremy back into the room. He didn't trust Davies anymore, as he suspected that he was possibly acting out earlier on, pretending he didn't want to allow Ida inside.
"Take a few men with you and search her house. My painting is in this woman's possession, but I need to have evidence in order to take action. She's working with someone in the castle, too. Speak to a few people. Try to find out who's involved. Also, find out what her stepmother is planning with that man, Londus."
Jeremy looked a little surprised, but quickly assured Caspian that he would get the king everything as was requested and needed for evidence. The king smiled to himself, thinking that he needed to pay someone a visit. It was time, and he couldn't wait any longer. Either way, she wasn't going to marry Londus, because her heart belonged to him. 2 hours later, after leaving the castle and wandering around the forest, the king located the old cottage hidden in the deepest parts of the woodland. Many years ago, he'd promised himself that he would stay away from the old witch, but current circumstances forced him to look for her once more. She was the one person from his past he knew with absolute certainty who could help him figure out a few things. He'd been turned by a sadistic vampire who'd only used him to survive. He didn't tell Cindy the whole truth about his past. His maker had nearly killed him as he attempted to transform him into a vampire. Caspian had been dying when he'd escaped from the creature who'd drained his blood. He'd wandered around the forest for hours before the old witch had found him. She was skilled, and her magic was much more powerful than the magic of fairies. She'd nursed him back to health. She told him that one day he would come seeking her help once again, and now it turned out she had been speaking the truth. Over the years, he'd forgotten about her, and she had never sent for him, even when he'd become the King of Farrington. Smoke rose from the chimney, and he sensed her inside. The old witch was much more powerful than him, but he'd never trusted her. He believed that she'd secretly taken his blood, as she'd attempted to heal him. That's why he'd never returned. Then a split second later, the door opened, and he could see her standing in the shadow, leaning against a long stick.
"I thought you had forgotten about me, Vampire King,"
the old woman said. Caspian's past flashed before his eyes, and his craving for blood burned his throat. He sensed magic circulating around him. Her energy was still vital. Nothing had changed after 20 years, but he noticed that she'd aged.
"I need your help, old witch,"
he said as he approached her. She was an old woman with long grey hair and wrinkles marring most of her face. The king was surprised she was still alive, although it seemed that her magic hadn't diminished with age. Caspian remembered those green eyes that were now staring straight through him.
"You're in love, and you think that you're about to lose her. Don't worry, I can help you,"
she said, and then gestured for him to enter the cottage.
"This one is very special."
The king hesitated. He knew he would need to sacrifice something for the information he required. He couldn't lose her as he had his first wife, Catherine. The cottage had a low ceiling and was supported by old wooden beams. There was a table and chairs, and a large pot was boiling in a fireplace filled with logs. The cottage smelled of sage, thyme, and blood. The witch must have slaughtered an animal there earlier, because the king could smell it everywhere.
"I'm more concerned about her stepmother. I was wondering how she gained her magic,"
he asked. The old witch smiled and stirred a strange substance inside her huge pot. Caspian had a feeling that she knew exactly of whom he was talking about.
"She was here in my cottage,"
she replied after some time, and now everything made sense to Caspian. Ida had gotten magic from the old witch.
"I need some of your love for Catherine in exchange for my help. Are you willing to sacrifice it?"
Caspian didn't want to spend the rest of his life utterly alone, and he couldn't lose her. The old witch could have asked for anything, and yet he didn't expect her to demand his most precious memories of his dead wife. "Yes, I am," he finally said. He was ready for anything to have a life with Cindy.